The result of Taiwan's freedom has been a spectacular climb from rags to riches. Its per capita income in 1998 was roughly $14,000, meaning that its wealth had increased 140 times in 50 years. Or put in other terms, its per capita wealth had doubled 7 times in 50 years. I mean, these are historically unprecedented. I mean, nothing like this has ever happened in the history of mankind. Communist China, by contrast, at the same time, was a brutally oppressive dictatorship where Mao Zedong murdered, we don't even know how many. The estimates today are 60 to 80 million. More than 60 to 80 million innocent victims, repressed all intellectual dissent and entrepreneurial initiative, caused massive famine and a destitution so pervasive that by the end of Mao's life in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of Chinese were subsisting on less than $1 a day. China made no economic advance whatsoever until Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s introduced some elements of capitalism into its system. Farmers were allowed some private property on which to work the land, and profit motive. They could sell, the output for profit. They opened, the Chinese regime allowed certain special enterprise zones, especially in Shanghai, where there were special free enterprise zones. And the country started to open up to international trade. China finally, over the last 30 years, began the agonizing climb out of crushing poverty. Today, China's per capita income is approaching $1,000, rising slowly at snail's pace from the starvation standards that held under Mao. But despite the intermixture of some freer elements, China remains a brutal dictatorship where they'll kill you for any type of dissent with the government. And as such, it can never equal the living standards in vastly freer, semi-capitalist Taiwan, much less Hong Kong, who at least they've had the good sense so far to leave alone. Now, in spite of the pervasive atrocities committed by Mao, the march of global capitalism in Asia could not be halted. Korea, divided in 1945 into freer and totalitarian halves, provided extraordinarily difficult conditions and a stern test for the budding capitalist system. For one thing, communist North Korea received most of the Japanese-built industry. The freer South got very little. But worse, South Korea was devastated by the communist invasion of the early 1950s. The war ended in 1953, and it was not until 1963 that the South's per capita income reached $100. But in the past 40 to 50 years, South Korea's economic progress has also been unprecedented, extraordinary. Under the influence of Stanford-trained economist Kim Jae-ik, the South Korean government moved toward privatization and diminished state intervention in the 1980s. Today, South Korea's per capita income is in excess of $11,000, an enormous increase over what it was just 50 years ago. By contrast, this is so painful, you don't even like to think about it, but communist North Korea, which according even to the United Nations, is the most brutally repressed dictatorship on earth. Communist North Korea is so primitive that satellite photographs at night reveal mostly darkness because the country lacks electricity. And even massive aid from the United States was insufficient to prevent hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions, from starving to death in North Korea in recent years. Now, additionally, Singapore has also rocketed upwards in the past 50 years. Singapore's political leaders began their careers as socialists, as committed statists. And that country, Singapore, is a dictatorship, make no mistake about it. But they have an enlightened dictator. They have a dictator who understands economics, and they basically keep the government out of the economic system. They have a free economic system by permission, by governmental permission, not by individual right. It's a privilege, not a right. But for the most part, they support the dictatorial regime in Singapore, protects private property rights that attract significant Western investment. The government imposes virtually no tariffs, supports international free trade, encourages entrepreneurship, and permits the market to generally set prices. This substantial element of freedom in Singapore's economy, again, freedom by permission, not by individual right, but the substantial element of economic freedom in Singapore's system have enabled it too to ascend in the past 5 decades into the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. The title of one of the histories of Singapore's spectacular rise from third world to first is accurate. Now, the success of the Asian tigers is a phenomenon of momentous historic significance, for it shows that Western concepts of reason, individual rights, limited government, rule of law, political economic freedom, and capitalism can be successfully established in previously non-Western third world countries. Let me repeat that. The success of the Asian tigers is a phenomenon of momentous historic significance, for it shows that Western concepts of reason, individual rights, limited government, rule of law, political economic freedom, and capitalism can be successfully established in previously non-Western third world countries. Reminds me of Orlando Patterson, who was a professor at Harvard. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he's a Caribbean sociologist and one of the world's leading experts on slavery and its history. And Professor Patterson, exhaustively researched the history of slavery and wrote one of the great books on slavery and social death, I think is the title. And one of the lines in there, as a result of his research, will just pop your eyeballs. He said, there was no word, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I'm paraphrasing, there was no word for freedom in any of the languages of non-Western peoples until their contact with Western civilization. There was no word for freedom in the language. And that's because, I think, now this is me speaking, because you need a principle of individual rights to have a conception of freedom. It can't exist under the tribalism that has dominated most of the world. And individual rights is an 18th century development. It's never been strong in the Western world. Even in the Western world where it's created, it's fought a constant battle against various forms of statism and collectivism. The idea that your life belongs to you, rather than to the state, the collective, the church, God, the people, the race, the proletariat, whatever. That some form of collectivism or statism has been the status quo throughout. But individualism and individual rights has some history in the West, and it's, although minority history, but up until very recently it's had none in other parts of the world. Now the Soviet Union and its conquered satellite states failed in their attempt to export communism around the world. And today, early in the 21st century, communism is dead as a force able to inspire millions or move the world. Although, as the joke in Poland, after the fall of communism there and its rise, its movement towards individualizing capitalism and its economic rise, the joke in Poland in the 90s was that Marxist professors can now be hired only in American universities. This is, I think, sadly true. Anyhow, the drive towards communism collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s, but the drive toward global capitalism continues. Now, this includes several former slave states of the Soviet Empire. For example, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, to name but 3, have taken substantial steps toward establishing legitimate political freedom in their countries, protecting an individual's freedom of speech, of intellectual expression, of the press, of religion, and of voting rights. In economics, these were the former Soviet-dominated states that moved most rapidly towards capitalism, i.e. that instituted privatization, deregulation, free trade, and above all, crucially, protection of private property rights. Poland had been terribly poor under communism, a so-called shortage economy, because of the continuing dearth of consumer goods. In the 1970s, Poland had found it necessary to borrow billions of dollars from the West, and unable to feed its own population, imported enormous amounts of food from America and Canada.